Before anything was written down, before memory learned how to preserve itself in symbols and marks, there was a world that breathed quietly beneath the stars. A world that did not know it would one day be forgotten. Imagine, for a moment, standing at the edge of a coastline that no longer exists. The air is cool but gentle. The sea lies far beyond the horizon, hundreds of miles away from where it rests today. In front of you stretches a vast plain, green and alive, crossed by slow rivers that reflect the pale light of an unfamiliar sky. There are no borders here, no nations, only land, water, sky, and time moving patiently forward. This is not a fantasy. This is Earth as it once was. Long before the last ice age tightened its grip on the planet, the world was different in ways that are difficult to fully imagine. Sea levels were far lower, exposing immense coastal regions that are now submerged beneath oceans. Entire landscapes existed where only water remains today. Forests grew where continental shelves now sleep in darkness. Rivers carved valleys that have since been erased by the sea, and within this forgotten world, human beings lived. Not as we often picture them, not merely scattered bands of survivors huddled against nature, but perhaps as something more organized, more connected, more aware of their environment than we tend to assume. This idea does not require machines or metals or towering cities of glass and steel. It requires only time, stability, and memory. Time enough to observe the heavens, stability enough to settle, to build, to plan, memory enough to pass knowledge forward. For tens of thousands of years before the Ice Age reached its peak, Earth experienced long periods of relative climatic calm. Generations lived and died beneath predictable skies. Seasons returned reliably, rivers flooded and receded, animals migrated along known paths, plants grew in familiar cycles. In such conditions, humans did what they have always done when given peace and continuity. They learned. They learned the stars, noticing patterns that returned year after year. They learned stone, discovering how to shape it, stack it, and align it with care. They learned the land, mapping it not with ink, but with stories and paths worn smooth by countless footsteps. They learned water, where it flowed, where it pooled, and how it could sustain life. And perhaps slowly they learned how to connect across distances we once thought impossible. The exposed lands between continents created natural bridges. Regions that are now oceans were once highways of migration and exchange. The world was not divided as it is today. It was open, continuous, reachable. In such a world, ideas could travel. A technique learned in one valley might find its way generations later to a distant shore. A shared understanding of the sky might spread across thousands of miles, carried not by written language but by ritual, song, and repetition. Knowledge did not need permanence in stone tablets or books. It lived in people. This is the world that existed before the cold began to deepen. At first, the changes were subtle. Winters lingered a little longer, summers felt shorter. Glaciers high in the mountains crept forward almost imperceptibly, year by year. To those living through it, the shift may have seemed manageable, even temporary. After all, climates had changed before. Humanity had adapted many times already, but this change did not reverse. The cooling continued, ice expanded, snow that once melted now remained. Over centuries and then millennia, enormous ice sheets began their slow, unstoppable movement southward. They were not sudden. They did not arrive in a single catastrophic moment. They advanced patiently, relentlessly, reshaping the world as they moved. Forests thinned, grasslands retreated, rivers altered their paths. Communities that had lived for generations in familiar regions found themselves facing unfamiliar conditions. Some adapted, shifting their settlements, altering their ways of life. Others migrated following animals, water, and warmth, and some may have stayed too long, watching the land they knew slowly become unrecognizable. As ice accumulated, sea levels dropped even further. Paradoxically, the oceans pulled back as more water became locked away in frozen form. Coastlines extended outward, exposing vast new lands, but these lands were cold, windswept, and unstable. What was gained in space was lost in comfort. The world grew harsher. And yet, even in this growing cold, life continued. Humans did not disappear. They endured. They adapted. They carried with them fragments of what had come before: techniques, stories, alignments, memories of a warmer, gentler world. But the Ice Age was not only cold, it was unpredictable. Periods of extreme freezing were interrupted by sudden warming events. Massive ice dams would form and then collapse. Glacial lakes would burst, releasing unimaginable volumes of water across the land. Entire regions could be flooded in days, reshaping landscapes that had existed for thousands of years. For those living through these moments, the experience would have been overwhelming. Rivers where none had existed before, valleys transformed into inland seas, familiar landmarks erased beneath sediment and water, and then eventually something even more profound began to happen. The ice started to melt. At first, the melting may have felt like relief, warmer air, retreating glaciers, renewed plant growth, but the scale of what followed was unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. As the great ice sheets melted, sea levels began to rise, not gradually over tens of thousands of years, but sometimes in sudden pulses. Coastal plains vanished beneath encroaching water, river mouths flooded, low-lying settlements were lost first, then entire regions. The very places most likely to have supported early, stable civilizations, coastlines, river deltas, fertile plains, were the ones erased most completely. If there had been networks of communities spread across these lands, they would not have vanished all at once. They would have fractured, separated by rising seas, cut off from one another, forced inland, uphill, into unfamiliar terrain. Knowledge does not survive fragmentation easily. A practice that once made sense in one environment may become useless in another. A stone alignment tied to a specific horizon loses meaning when the landscape shifts. Navigation methods become unreliable when coastlines change. Over generations, what was once practical understanding becomes story, symbol, myth. The survivors would have carried memories of a lost world not as clear histories but as impressions, tales of lands swallowed by water, of ancestors who lived where the sea now lies, of a time when the world was larger, flatter, more generous. These stories would not be told as geology, they would be told as legend. And as centuries passed, those legends would grow softer at the edges, details would fade, meaning would shift, the past would become sacred, distant, unreachable. Teachers of old knowledge might be remembered as giants, gods, or beings from another age. Meanwhile, the physical traces of that earlier world would be disappearing. Wood decays, earth erodes, even stone, given enough time, crumbles or is buried. And beneath rising oceans, preservation becomes complicated. Saltwater corrodes, currents scatter, sediment blankets what remains. What was once lived upon becomes unreachable, hidden beneath hundreds of feet of water and thousands of years of silence. By the time the Ice Age finally loosened its hold and a more stable climate returned, humanity was no longer living in the same world it had begun in. The landscape had changed, the seas had risen, the old connections were gone. Civilization, as we define it today, would eventually rise again, independently in multiple places, shaped by new environments and new challenges. Writing would emerge, monuments would be built, history would begin recording itself. But something would already have been lost, not necessarily a single global empire, not machines or metals beyond their time, but perhaps a quieter form of advancement, a deep familiarity with the earth, the sky, and the rhythms of nature. A world-spanning web of shared understanding that required stability to survive, and stability had ended. What remains today are hints, strange alignments that seem older than expected, myths shared across continents that speak of floods, lost lands, and ancient teachers, submerged structures glimpsed briefly beneath shallow seas, questions that linger without answers. They do not prove anything on their own, but they invite us to wonder. As the first stars of night appear above the ancient world, as ice begins its long descent from the poles, and as humanity stands unknowingly at the edge of forgetting, one question remains quietly suspended in time. What if the Ice Age did not simply challenge early humans? What if it erased the memory of a world we once knew? And what if the echoes of that world are still sleeping beneath the oceans, waiting patiently to be remembered? In the long silence that followed the melting of the ice, the world settled into a new shape. The great floods slowed, the oceans reached their present boundaries. The land, once vast and open, became divided by water, mountain, and distance. Humanity found itself living on islands of memory, separated not only by geography but by time. Those who survived the great transitions did not think of themselves as survivors of a lost age. They thought only of living, of finding food, of shelter, of teaching their children where the rivers ran and when the seasons turned. The past, immense and overwhelming, became quieter with each passing generation. What had once been shared knowledge became localized wisdom. A method remembered by one group was forgotten by another. A story preserved in one valley faded entirely in the next. Over centuries, the threads that once connected distant peoples unraveled until they no longer appeared connected at all. And yet, fragments endured. In places far apart, people began to tell strangely similar stories. Stories of a great water that rose and swallowed the land. Stories of ancestors who fled from a sinking homeland. Stories of teachers who arrived after the disaster, carrying knowledge from a time before. These stories were not identical, but they rhymed. They shared shapes, emotions, and themes as if they had grown from the same ancient seed. In some traditions, the flood was punishment. In others, it was renewal. In many, it was simply inevitable, a force of nature too powerful to resist. Rarely was it described as a single event. More often, it was remembered as a process, a slow drowning of the familiar world. Memory, after all, does not preserve dates, it preserves feelings: fear, loss, awe, survival. As human communities adapted to their new environments, they began to build again, not immediately and not in the same ways. The knowledge that survived was shaped by necessity. Stone tools remained essential. Fire was guarded carefully. Shelters were built with what was available. Over time, people began to settle once more near rivers and coasts, drawn instinctively to the same places their ancestors had favored for tens of thousands of years. But now, those places were different. River valleys were narrower, coastlines were steeper, fertile plains were smaller and more fragmented. The earth had become less forgiving, and humanity adapted accordingly. Life became more localized, cultures diverged, languages drifted apart. What had once been a broadly shared understanding of the world slowly transformed into regional worldviews, and yet occasionally something remarkable emerged. Across different continents, people who had never met began to build structures that seemed to echo a distant past. Stone circles aligned with the sun. pillars oriented toward solstices and equinoxes, mounds raised with careful geometry. These were not random acts. They required planning, cooperation, and patience. They also required memory. Even if the original reasons were forgotten, the impulse remained to mark the sky, to anchor time, to create a bridge between earth and the heavens. Perhaps these structures were not inventions but recollections, not innovations but echoes. It is possible that the builders did not know why their ancestors had once aligned stone with star. They only knew that it mattered, that it had always been done, that it connected them to something older than themselves. In this way, the past did not vanish completely. It softened, it became symbolic, sacred, and as symbolism replaced understanding, myth was born. Gods descended from the sky. Ancient beings taught humanity. Golden ages ended in catastrophe. These stories may not be literal accounts of lost technology or forgotten cities, but they may be something just as valuable emotional truths encoded in narrative, a way of remembering that the world had once been different and that it could change again. As thousands of years passed, the ice age faded from living memory. Glaciers retreated to the poles and mountains. The climate stabilized into patterns recognizable today. Forests returned, grasslands expanded, rivers found steady courses. Humanity entered a new chapter. Agriculture emerged independently in multiple regions as if guided by an old instinct. People domesticated plants and animals. Settlements grew. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Writing appeared, allowing memory to be preserved outside the human mind for the first time. History began, but history as written always begins late. It records what survives, not what was lost. The earliest written records already speak of beginnings, of first kings, of divine origins. They do not speak of an ice age that reshaped the world or of coastlines that vanished beneath the sea. They inherit myths, not memories. And so the written story of civilization begins on land that is already altered, already incomplete. Beneath the oceans, however, the older world remains. Along continental shelves, where the sea is shallow, lie landscapes that once felt sunlight and rain. Ancient riverbeds still carve paths across the seabed. Submerged plains stretch silently beneath the waves. In rare moments of clarity, stone shapes appear ambiguous, eroded, uncertain. Are they natural? Are they human? Or are they something in between, the remnants of a world not meant to last? The ocean is not kind to memory. It buries, scatters, and erases. But it also preserves, sealing away what it covers, protecting it from weather, from fire, from human disturbance. What lies beneath the sea is not destroyed in the same way as what lies exposed on land. It sleeps, and sleep, as we know, is not the same as death. If an advanced global culture had existed before the Ice Age, not advanced in machines but in connection, it would have been most visible along coastlines, along rivers, in places where trade, travel, and exchange were easiest. These are precisely the places that disappeared first when the ice melted. Inland sites survived better. High ground endured. And so the archaeological record is biased, incomplete, shaped by survival rather than truth. This does not mean the past was more extraordinary than we imagine. It means it was different. It means that our picture of early humanity may be missing entire chapters, not because they were insignificant, but because they were fragile. Because they were built in harmony with a world that no longer exists. As night settles over the present world and waves move endlessly across drowned lands, it is worth considering how little of our own civilization would survive a similar transformation. If the seas were to rise again, if coastlines vanished, if cities were abandoned and forgotten, what would remain after 10,000 years? A few stones, a few alignments, a few stories distorted by time. Future minds might look at those remnants and wonder, just as we do now. They might ask whether we truly understood the world we lived in, or whether we too were inheritors of something older, something already forgotten. The Ice Age did not simply reshape the Earth, it reshaped memory. It narrowed humanity's awareness, focusing it inward toward survival, toward immediacy. In doing so, it allowed a deeper past to fade quietly into the background, but fading is not the same as disappearing. Every so often, a discovery unsettles the silence, a tool older than expected. A structure that does not fit established timelines, a myth that refuses to remain local, appearing instead across oceans and continents. These are not answers, they are invitations, invitations to listen more carefully, to imagine more gently, to accept that the story of humanity may be longer, slower, and more complex than we have been taught. And so, as the night deepens and the world grows quiet, we are left not with certainty, but with possibility. With the idea that before the ice, before the floods, before the long forgetting, there may have been a time when humanity knew itself differently. A time when the earth felt larger, when the seas were farther away, when knowledge traveled without writing, when memory lived in people, not pages. And though that world is gone, its echoes remain in stone, in story, and in the quiet sense that something ancient is still watching, still waiting beneath the waves. As the echoes of that ancient world settled beneath the oceans, humanity moved forward without realizing how much it had left behind. The generations that followed the great changes did not see themselves as living after a collapse. To them, this was simply the world as it had always been. Mountains stood where they stood, seas ended where they ended, memory began at the edge of the visible land, and yet something subtle lingered, a sense that the world had once been broader. A feeling that the horizon had once stretched farther, an intuition that the past held more than stories alone. In the quiet moments when the sky was clear and the stars appeared in their steady procession, people looked upward with familiarity rather than confusion. They did not invent meaning in the heavens, they recognized it. The stars were not random. They returned, season after season, year after year, marking time with perfect patience. Long before written calendars, the sky was the calendar. Across distant regions, humans began orienting their lives around celestial rhythms, planting when certain stars rose, gathering when others faded, honoring moments when the sun reached its highest or lowest point in the sky. These practices did not emerge overnight. They required long observation, repetition, trust in patterns that unfolded slowly across generations. This kind of knowledge is not easily rediscovered from nothing. It is inherited. Perhaps this is why similar sky traditions appeared independently in places that had no contact with one another, or at least no contact we recognize today. The shared impulse suggests something deeper than coincidence. It suggests memory moving quietly through time, reshaped but persistent. The Ice Age had scattered humanity, but it had not erased its instincts. As communities stabilized, some began to gather more densely. Rivers once again became lifelines. Fertile valleys invited settlement. Slowly, people began to build with intention. Not only shelters, but spaces that held meaning, places where time, land, and sky converged. Stone was chosen not because it was impressive, but because it endured. In a world still haunted by instability, permanence mattered. Large stones required coordination, planning, shared purpose. These were not the works of isolated individuals. They were communal acts carried out over years, sometimes generations. The builders may not have known the original reason behind every placement, but they knew the importance of continuing the pattern. In this way, ancient practices survived as ritual. Ritual preserves behavior long after understanding fades. A gesture repeated enough times becomes tradition. A tradition repeated enough times becomes sacred. and the sacred is protected even when its origin is forgotten. This may explain why early monumental sites feel older than the cultures attributed to them. Why they seem to appear suddenly, fully formed, without clear developmental steps. Perhaps they were not new ideas at all, but revived one's echoes of a much earlier worldview, resurfacing when conditions allowed. As time passed, humanity grew more confident in its place within the new world. Tools improved, agriculture expanded, social hierarchies formed, writing emerged, anchoring memory in symbols that could outlast the human lifespan. But writing, for all its power, is selective. It records what seems important at the moment it is created. It favors rulers, rituals, and resources. It captures recent victories more readily than ancient losses, and it almost never records what has already been forgotten. By the time writing began, the Ice Age was no longer a lived experience. Its true scale had slipped beyond memory. Floods became myths. Lost lands became sacred realms. The teachers of old became gods or demigods, elevated beyond history. In many traditions, the earliest age is described as a golden one, a time when humans lived closer to the divine, when knowledge flowed freely, when the world was whole. This age always ends in disaster, a flood, a fire, a great darkness. What follows is a lesser age marked by struggle and fragmentation. These stories are often dismissed as symbolic, and perhaps they are, but symbols often grow from experience. They compress reality into forms that can survive time. A global culture destroyed by the Ice Age would not be remembered as a society with borders and institutions. It would be remembered as a time before separation, before loss, before the world broke apart. As centuries turned into millennia, the physical evidence of that earlier world continued to vanish. Erosion softened stone edges. Sediment buried foundations. Vegetation reclaimed abandoned spaces. And beneath the sea, pressure and darkness preserved landscapes in silence. Occasionally, chance reveals something unexpected. A fishing net catches on a submerged structure. A sonar scan reveals unnatural geometry. A diver notices stones placed where stones should not naturally rest. These moments are fleeting, inconclusive, easy to dismiss, and so they are often set aside, categorized as anomalies rather than invitations. The past, after all, is easier to manage when it is small. Yet the sheer scale of submerged land suggests that what we see on today's maps is only a fraction of what once existed. Entire coastlines, longer than all modern shorelines combined, lie hidden beneath the oceans. These were not empty spaces. They were the most habitable regions on the planet for early humans. If humanity had ever developed a connected culture, this is where it would have thrived. Trade routes would have followed rivers now drowned. Settlements would have clustered along shores now erased. Paths worn by countless feet now lie beneath layers of silt and time. The absence of evidence does not necessarily mean absence of existence. It often means absence of access. Modern humans tend to think of progress as linear, a steady climb from simplicity to complexity. But nature rarely moves in straight lines. It cycles, it expands and contracts, it builds and erases. Life adapts not by ascending endlessly, but by responding to changing conditions. Civilization may be no different. It may rise when the world allows stability. It may fragment when the world demands survival. And it may leave behind traces so subtle that they can only be felt, not proven. The idea of an advanced global culture before the Ice Age does not require lost machines or forgotten technologies beyond imagination. It requires only that humans once had more time to observe, to connect, to refine their relationship with the planet. A civilization of awareness rather than industry, of memory rather than monuments, of alignment rather than domination. Such a culture would leave few scars on the land, its disappearance would be quiet, its legacy would be fragile, and perhaps that is why it is so difficult to see. As the modern world rushes forward, measuring progress in speed and scale, the ancient past waits patiently. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not demand belief. It simply remains layered beneath our assumptions, asking only that we consider the possibility of depth. Depth of time, depth of experience, depth of forgetting. The Ice Age was not an ending, it was a narrowing, a focusing of humanity's attention onto immediate needs. In doing so, it allowed something expansive to slip beyond reach, not destroyed but overshadowed by necessity. Yet even now, in quiet moments, that deeper past seems close. It is felt in the instinct to look to the sky for guidance, in the comfort found near water, in the pull toward certain landscapes that feel familiar without explanation. These instincts did not arise recently. They were shaped over immense spans of time, under skies and coastlines unlike our own. As night settles once more over the present earth, the oceans continue their slow motion, waves passing endlessly over drowned plains. The stars above remain unchanged, indifferent to memory and forgetting alike. And somewhere between sea and sky, between story and stone, the possibility lingers that before the ice, before the floods, before history learned how to write itself, humanity may have known the world in a way we are only beginning to imagine. In the long span of human existence, forgetting is far easier than remembering. Memory requires continuity, and continuity is fragile. It depends on stable land, predictable seasons, and generations able to live close enough in time and place to pass understanding forward without interruption. The Ice Age did not merely interrupt this chain, it stretched it thin, frayed it, and in many places severed it entirely. What followed was not ignorance but simplification. As the world reshaped itself, humanity reshaped its priorities. Survival came first: warmth, food, safety. The luxury of deep contemplation, of long-term observation, of carefully maintained traditions tied to specific landscapes became harder to sustain. Knowledge that did not immediately help people live through the cold was set aside. This is how wisdom disappears. Not in a single dramatic moment, but quietly, as fewer people find it useful and fewer still remember why it mattered. In this narrowing of focus, the human relationship with the earth changed. Where once people may have felt embedded within a vast, interconnected system, they now experience the land as something to endure. The sky still mattered, but in a more urgent way. Seasons were watched closely not for ceremony but for survival. Migration routes were remembered because forgetting them meant death, and yet even under these pressures the human mind retained a remarkable capacity for abstraction. Symbol did not vanish, meaning did not disappear, it adapted. The stories told around fires during long winters became vessels for memory. Not precise memory, but emotional memory. They carried impressions of a warmer world, of abundance, of balance. They spoke of ancestors who lived differently, who possessed knowledge that now felt distant and unreachable. Over time, these ancestors became idealized. They were described as taller, wiser, closer to the gods, not because they literally were, but because they represented a time before loss. Before the struggle felt so constant, before the world demanded so much just to remain alive, this transformation of memory into myth was not a failure, it was a survival strategy. Myth compresses vast spans of experience into forms that can be remembered when details cannot. It preserves meaning when facts fade. Through myth, the idea of a prior age endured. As the climate slowly stabilized and the Ice Age receded, humanity emerged into a world that felt new, even though it was layered atop the old. Forests spread into once barren regions. Rivers settled into calmer courses. Animals returned in greater numbers. The urgency of survival softened just enough to allow curiosity to reawaken. People began to pause again, to observe, to plan beyond the next season. It is here in this threshold between survival and stability that something ancient stirred. Humans did not invent curiosity anew. They remembered it. They returned to the sky with renewed interest, noticing again the slow movements of the sun and stars, recognizing patterns that felt oddly familiar as if they had been known before. In some places, this recognition blossomed into careful observation. In others, it took the form of reverence. Stone markers appeared. Sacred hills were chosen. Natural features were imbued with meaning. These acts were not random, they were selective. Certain locations drew attention again and again across cultures and generations. High ground overlooking water, points where land and sky met in dramatic alignment, places where sound carried strangely or light behaved in unexpected ways. Perhaps these locations had mattered before. Perhaps they were revisited not by accident but by instinct, a faint pull toward places once known, now barely remembered. As human societies grew more complex, they developed new tools for preserving memory. Language grew richer, symbols became standardized. Eventually, writing emerged, allowing information to survive beyond the lifespan of any individual. But writing did not restore what had been lost. It began recording history at a moment when the deeper past was already mythologized. The earliest texts speak confidently of beginnings, of first kings, of divine instruction. They do not speak of slow climatic collapse or submerged continents. The Ice Age by then was too distant to describe accurately. What writing preserved was the memory of forgetting. Stories of floods, stories of lost lands, stories of a world remade. These accounts appear across cultures not because they describe the same event in detail, but because they express the same trauma. The sense that the ground beneath humanity had once shifted dramatically, that the familiar had become unfamiliar. That something precious had been taken by forces beyond control. In this way, the Ice Age became a shadow rather than a chapter, and shadows are difficult to study. Modern perspectives often seek sharp boundaries, before and after, primitive and advanced, ignorant and enlightened. But the reality of deep time is softer, more fluid. Progress does not move cleanly forward. It drifts, it circles, it forgets and remembers in fragments. If an advanced global culture existed before the Ice Age, it may not resemble our modern idea of advancement at all. It may not have sought domination over nature, but alignment with it. It may not have built upward, but outward, spreading gently across landscapes that invited settlement. Such a culture would leave little behind once those landscapes disappeared. No towering ruins, no lasting infrastructure. Only subtle alterations, paths, alignments, modified stone, easily mistaken for natural formations after thousands of years. And perhaps this is why the idea feels elusive. It asks us to expand our definition of civilization beyond material output, to consider intelligence expressed through balance rather than accumulation. As the modern world looks back, armed with technology and data, it searches for evidence that fits its expectations. Metal tools, clear stratification. Urban density. These markers are useful, but they are not universal. They reflect one path among many. The deep past may have followed a different path entirely, one shaped by long-term observation rather than rapid innovation, by oral transmission rather than written record, by adaptation rather than expansion. Such a path would be extraordinarily vulnerable to disruption. A prolonged climatic shift would not just damage it, it would dissolve it. And that dissolution would look, from a distance of thousands of years, like absence. Yet absence can be misleading. Consider how much of our own world would remain if the seas rose suddenly and dramatically. Coastal cities would vanish first, trade networks would collapse, knowledge centers would be lost, survivors would retreat inland, carrying only fragments of what once existed. In a few thousand years, future observers might find scattered ruins and conflicting stories. They might argue over whether a connected global civilization ever existed. They might dismiss the idea as myth, citing the lack of evidence. They would not be wrong, they would simply be incomplete. The Ice Age reminds us that the Earth is not a static stage upon which humanity acts. It is an active participant in the story. It reshapes the rules without warning. It erases as easily as it creates. And humanity, for all its adaptability, remains deeply tied to the stability of its environment. The notion that a prior world existed, one that felt larger, more connected, more whole, resonates not because it promises lost glory, but because it reflects a truth we still sense. That stability is temporary. That memory is fragile. That what feels permanent rarely is. As the night deepens and the mind drifts, it becomes easier to imagine that ancient world, not as a place of marvels, but as a place of familiarity. A world where humans moved across vast lands without borders. Where coastlines were places of meeting rather than edges of maps. Where the sky was a shared reference and time unfolded slowly. A world that did not know it was standing on the edge of disappearance. And perhaps that is the quietest lesson of all, that civilizations do not always fall in fire and noise. Sometimes they fade beneath ice. Sometimes they drown beneath rising seas. Sometimes they simply become stories told softly until even the stories blur. But beneath the blur, beneath the silence, something remains. A question, a pull, a sense that the past is deeper than it appears. And as long as that sense endures, the story is not finished. It continues patiently beneath the waves and within the quiet spaces of the human mind. Long after the ice had retreated and the seas had settled into their new shapes, humanity found itself standing on ground that felt both familiar and strange. Familiar because people had always lived beneath the same sky. Strange because the land no longer told the same stories it once had. Valleys ended abruptly at water. Hills rose where plains had been remembered in myth. The world felt smaller, more enclosed, as if something vast had been folded away. And with that change came a subtle shift in how humans understood themselves. Where once identity may have been shaped by movement across wide territories, it now became rooted in place. Villages formed, then towns. Boundaries emerged first as practical markers, later as symbolic ones. The sense of belonging narrowed, focusing inward rather than outward. This narrowing brought stability, but it also brought forgetting. Generations born into the post-Ice Age world inherited stories without context. They heard of floods but did not see the drowned lands. They heard of ancient teachers but did not know the conditions that had made such teachers necessary. They inherited fragments, not frameworks. And so meaning shifted. What was once a memory of survival through environmental collapse became a moral tale. What was once a recollection of migration became a story of exile. What was once an account of loss became a warning, a parable, or a sacred mystery. This transformation was not deliberate, it was inevitable. Human memory reshapes itself to serve the present. As societies grew more complex, they developed explanations for the world that matched their lived experience. Gods were placed in the sky because the sky felt distant and powerful. Sacred realms were imagined beneath the earth because the earth concealed secrets. Oceans became symbols of chaos because they had once swallowed entire worlds. In this way, the Ice Age lived on not as climate data but as worldview, the fear of imbalance, the reverence for cycles, the deep unease around sudden change. These feelings became embedded in culture, influencing how people built, worshipped, and governed. They shaped architecture that emphasized permanence. They shaped rituals that sought to appease unseen forces. They shaped calendars that carefully tracked time as if to ensure that the world would not surprise humanity again. Perhaps this is why so many early civilizations invested such energy into predicting and controlling the environment. Flood management, seasonal rituals, astronomical observation. These were not merely practical pursuits, they were acts of reassurance. If the sky could be understood, perhaps it could be trusted. If the seasons could be predicted, perhaps they could be endured. If time could be measured, perhaps it would not betray humanity again. Yet beneath these efforts lay a quiet awareness that control was always partial, that the earth moved on scales beyond human influence, that what had happened once could happen again. This awareness did not vanish with progress. It remained, shaping anxiety and ambition alike. As centuries turned into millennia, the deep past became increasingly abstract. People spoke confidently of their origins, even as those origins grew ever more simplified. Creation myths condensed vast timelines into symbolic moments. The Ice Age, if remembered at all, was compressed into a single flood or a single catastrophe. The complexity of change was reduced to a story that could be told in one sitting, and yet occasionally something resisted compression. Certain places carried a sense of age that felt disproportionate to their visible history. Certain stones felt older than the stories told about them. Certain alignments seemed too precise, too deliberate to be accidental. These anomalies did not shout, they whispered. They suggested continuity rather than invention, inheritance rather than discovery. People stood before ancient sites and felt a connection they could not explain, a sense of reverence that did not arise from doctrine but from recognition. As if something in the human mind remembered what the conscious self could not. This phenomenon is difficult to measure but easy to feel. It appears in the way humans instinctively gather at certain locations, in the way myths cluster around specific landscapes, in the way symbols recur across cultures that had no recorded contact. These patterns do not prove the existence of a lost global culture, but they hint at shared experience, at long-term exposure to similar conditions, at memory shaped by a world that once demanded a broader awareness. The Ice Age forced humanity to contract, but it did not erase the imprint of expansion. That imprint may be the source of humanity's recurring longing for unity, the persistent idea that the world was once whole. That separation is unnatural, that borders are temporary. Such ideas arise again and again, despite historical evidence of conflict and division. They appear not as political arguments, but as deep-seated intuitions, a sense that humanity is meant to be connected, not isolated. Perhaps this intuition is older than civilization itself. Perhaps it is a memory of a time when land connected what water now divides, when movement was easier, when exchange did not require negotiation, when the world invited exploration rather than restriction. If so, then the Ice Age did more than reshape geography. It reshaped the human psyche. It introduced the concept of scarcity, of competition, of protectionism, not because humans became less capable, but because the environment demanded it. In this way, the loss of a potentially connected ancient culture may not be visible in ruins but in behavior, in the shift from openness to defense, from wandering to settling, from shared knowledge to guarded tradition. These shifts were necessary, they were adaptive, they allowed humanity to survive. But survival always comes with trade-offs. As the modern world reflects on its origins, it often seeks dramatic answers, monumental discoveries, definitive proof, clear timelines, but the truth of deep history may be subtler. It may exist not in artifacts alone, but in patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior that persist across time. The idea of a pre-Ice Age global culture may never be confirmed in the way modern science prefers. Its traces may be too dispersed, too eroded, too deeply submerged, but its influence may still be present, quietly shaping how humans relate to the world, in the reverence for ancient sites, in the shared language of myth, in the instinctive pull toward water and sky, in the unease surrounding rapid environmental change. These are not random traits, they are responses shaped by long experience. As the night stretches on and the mind drifts, it becomes easier to imagine that the past is not gone but layered. That beneath the visible world lies another, quieter one still influencing the surface in subtle ways. The Ice Age did not erase everything. It filtered, it selected, it allowed some things to pass through while others were left behind. What passed through were instincts, emotions, patterns of attention. What remained behind were details, names, structures tied too closely to a vanished landscape. And so humanity moved forward carrying an invisible inheritance. An inheritance not of tools or cities, but of awareness. A sense that the world is dynamic, that stability is temporary. That memory must be tended carefully or it will fade. Perhaps this is why humans feel compelled to record, to archive, to preserve. Why there is such urgency to document the present, as if aware that it too may one day slip beyond reach. The Ice Age taught humanity at great cost that nothing is guaranteed. Not land, not climate, not continuity, and yet it also demonstrated resilience, the ability to adapt, to rebuild, to rediscover meaning even after immense loss. This resilience is not new. It did not begin with agriculture or industry. It was forged in deep time under ice and flood. As the imagined ancient world slips further into silence, it leaves behind not answers but a posture, a way of being attentive, of listening to the land, of respecting cycles larger than human ambition. Perhaps this is the quiet wisdom that survived when everything else was lost, not a blueprint for civilization, not a set of technologies, but an understanding that humanity exists within a living system that remembers even when we forget. And as long as the earth continues its slow rhythms and humans continue to look up at the same stars, that understanding remains accessible, not through excavation alone, but through reflection. In the quiet that follows reflection, when the mind loosens its grip on certainty, a deeper awareness begins to surface. It is in this softened state that the distant past feels closest, not as a sequence of events, but as a presence, a slow, steady undercurrent beneath modern thought. Humanity has always sensed this undercurrent. It emerges in moments of stillness, when the world seems older than language. When standing alone beneath an open sky, far from artificial light, there is a subtle feeling of recognition. Not recognition of a specific memory, but of belonging, as though the human mind is attuned to rhythms far older than any single lifetime. This attunement did not arise by chance. It was shaped through unbroken exposure to nature across immense spans of time. Before walls, before cities, before names for borders, humans lived directly within the movements of the earth. The rise and fall of the sun governed activity. The phases of the moon shaped behavior. The stars provided orientation, both literal and symbolic. In such a world, awareness itself became a form of knowledge. To survive, people needed to notice small changes, subtle shifts in weather, animal behavior, water levels, plant cycles. Attention was sharpened, observation was continuous, memory was collective. This kind of intelligence does not leave behind obvious artifacts. It leaves behind habits of perception. If a pre-Ice Age global culture existed, it may have been bound together less by physical infrastructure and more by shared attentiveness. A mutual understanding of how to read the land and sky. A distributed network of lived knowledge maintained not by institutions but by repetition and presence. Such a system would be remarkably effective and remarkably vulnerable. It would thrive under stable conditions. It would dissolve under disruption. The Ice Age disrupted everything at once: temperature, geography, ecology. The pace of change exceeded the speed at which such a culture could adapt without losing cohesion. Knowledge tied to specific landscapes became obsolete. Practices refined over generations lost their relevance as environments shifted beyond recognition. What remained was not ignorance but disorientation. Imagine holding a map of a land that no longer exists. Rivers have vanished. Mountains have shifted. Coastlines have retreated or advanced beyond anything marked. The map is not wrong, it is simply outdated. The mind experienced something similar. As the Ice Age progressed, the mental maps humanity carried grew less accurate. Familiar cues no longer aligned with reality. Navigation, both physical and conceptual, became harder. In such circumstances, people simplify. They rely on what works immediately. They abandon what cannot be confirmed in the present moment. This is how deep memory slips away, not because it is false, but because it cannot be verified under new conditions. And yet, some aspects of that memory were resilient enough to survive transformation. Symbol endured, pattern endured, feeling endured. Across the world, humans continued to mark transitions between seasons, between life stages, between cycles of light and dark. These rituals may have changed in form, but their essence remained. They provided continuity when continuity was scarce. They also served as anchors, connecting people to something larger than themselves. Perhaps this is why ancient rituals often feel timeless, why they seem to reach beyond specific historical contexts. They are not inventions of a single era, but inheritances shaped by countless generations. In this sense, the Ice Age did not erase humanity's past, it compressed it. It folded immense experience into manageable forms. A story instead of a chronicle. A ritual instead of a record, a symbol instead of an explanation. As human societies re-emerged into stability, these compressed forms became foundations. New civilizations grew atop old intuitions. New technologies layered over ancient habits of thought. Progress did not replace the past, it built upon what remained accessible. Yet something essential had changed. The sense of global continuity was gone. Where once the world may have felt like a single, extended home, it now appeared fragmented. Seas divided lands, mountains isolated valleys. Travel became more difficult, more dangerous. Ideas spread more slowly. This fragmentation reinforced the impression that humanity had always been divided, that cultures had always developed independently, that shared patterns were coincidences rather than remnants. But deep time tells a different story. During the long pre-Ice Age period, when sea levels were lower and climates more consistent, the Earth offered pathways that no longer exist. Land bridges connected continents. Coastal plains provided expansive corridors for movement. Rivers flowed through regions now submerged. These were not marginal spaces, they were central. Human movement through them would have been constant, gradual, and unremarkable. Over thousands of years, this movement would have produced familiarity rather than novelty. Distant places would not have felt foreign, they would have felt like extensions of the known world. In such conditions, cultural exchange would not require trade agreements or exploration. It would occur naturally, through overlapping territories and shared resources. This kind of connectivity does not announce itself archaeologically. It does not produce sharp boundaries or sudden shifts in material culture. It produces continuity, and continuity is difficult to detect when it is later interrupted. When the Ice Age raised the seas and fragmented the land, it created the illusion of separation. Cultures that had once existed along gradients now appeared isolated. Their shared traits seemed mysterious. Scholars, looking backward through broken landscapes, saw difference where there had once been flow. This illusion persists today. Modern maps reinforce it. Modern narratives depend on it. But the earth remembers its former shapes even when we do not. Beneath the oceans lie not only submerged lands but submerged assumptions. The idea that early humanity was scattered, disconnected, and primitive rests partly on a landscape that no longer reflects the conditions under which humanity evolved. If we imagine the past using the present as our template, we inevitably misunderstand it. The Ice Age was not simply a climatic episode, it was a lens that distorted history. It filtered which evidence survived, it shaped which stories endured, it influenced how later societies understood their origins, and in doing so it quietly narrowed the range of possibilities we allow ourselves to consider. The notion of an advanced pre-Ice Age global culture challenges this narrowing, not by insisting on lost technologies or hidden empires, but by inviting a broader definition of advancement. Advancement as ecological literacy, advancement as long-term stability. Advancement as shared understanding across vast spaces. These qualities do not leave behind ruins that impress the eye. They leave behind coherence, and coherence is easily mistaken for coincidence when the context that produced it is gone. As the modern world grapples with its own environmental uncertainty, these ideas take on new resonance. Rising seas, shifting climates, disrupted ecosystems. Once again, humanity faces forces that operate beyond immediate control. And once again, questions arise about memory. What will survive? What will be forgotten? What will future generations inherit, not in objects, but in understanding? The Ice Age offers a quiet warning. That knowledge tied too tightly to a single set of conditions may not endure. That memory requires adaptation, not just preservation. That the most valuable wisdom may be the least visible. Perhaps the ancient world understood this. Perhaps its greatest achievement was not building something permanent, but living in a way that allowed continuity for as long as the earth permitted it. And when that permission was withdrawn, perhaps it dissolved with minimal resistance, leaving behind only what could be carried within the human mind. As the night deepens further and the mind drifts closer to sleep, it becomes easier to sense the humility embedded in this possibility. A civilization that did not seek to conquer time but to move with it. A culture that accepted impermanence as a given. Such a worldview feels strangely relevant now. In the end, the Ice Age did not silence the past completely. It softened it, blurred it, and scattered it across time. It transformed certainty into intuition and records into echoes. Those echoes remain. They live in the way humans instinctively look for patterns, in the way we tell stories of loss and renewal, in the way we feel drawn to ancient places without knowing why. They are quiet, they are patient, they do not demand belief. They simply wait beneath the noise of the present, reminding us that the story of humanity is deeper than it appears, and that beneath every ending lies a continuation, unfolding slowly across the vast and breathing memory of the earth. As awareness of this deep continuity settles, the the story of humanity begins to feel less like a straight path and more like a slow tide, advancing, retreating, reshaping the shoreline of memory with each movement. The Ice Age was one such tide, powerful enough to redraw the boundaries of the world and subtle enough to alter how humanity understood itself without ever announcing its presence. Those who lived through its long unfolding did not experience it as a singular era. They lived through moments, colder winters, longer migrations, unfamiliar landscapes. They adjusted, adapted, and passed on what they could. What they could not pass on was the full context of what was being lost. Context is the first casualty of deep time. Without context, knowledge becomes ritual. Without context, memory becomes myth. Without context, continuity becomes coincidence. And yet, the human mind is remarkably persistent. Continues to search for meaning, even when meaning has been fragmented. It continues to sense patterns, even when those patterns no longer serve an obvious function. This persistence is visible in the way humanity repeatedly returns to certain questions. Where did we come from? What was here before us? Why do we feel drawn to the past? These questions are not merely intellectual. They are emotional. They arise from a quiet recognition that our story did not begin where our records begin. That something larger preceded us, shaping us in ways we do not fully understand. As civilizations matured and expanded, they developed narratives that explained their origins in ways that felt complete. These narratives served important purposes. They unified communities. They justified social structures. They provided a sense of direction, but they also simplified. They compressed long, complex histories into manageable beginnings. They framed humanity's emergence as sudden rather than gradual. They implied that before a certain point, nothing of significance existed. This implication was comforting. It made the world feel knowable. Yet beneath that comfort, traces of unease remained. Why did similar myths appear in distant lands? Why did ancient structures share alignments across continents? Why did stories of lost worlds and ancient wisdom refuse to disappear? These questions persisted because they were never fully answered. They could not be because the evidence required to answer them lay beyond reach, beneath oceans, beneath ice, beneath layers of time. The Ice Age did not simply hide the past, it placed it out of context. When modern observers look at isolated ruins or ancient tools, they see fragments detached from the systems that once gave them meaning. It is like finding a single note from a symphony and trying to reconstruct the entire composition. The note is real, the sound is genuine. But the music is incomplete. This incompleteness invites speculation, but it also demands humility. It reminds us that absence of proof is not proof of absence, that the archaeological record is shaped not only by what existed, but by what survived. And survival is not evenly distributed across landscapes or eras. Coastal regions, which likely hosted dense human activity, were the most vulnerable to rising seas. River deltas, fertile plains, and lowlands, the cradles of sustained settlement, were among the first to disappear. What remains accessible today is skewed toward what happened to be built on higher ground. This skew has consequences. It shapes our assumptions. It limits our imagination. It reinforces narratives of isolation and primitiveness that may reflect preservation bias more than reality. The idea of a pre-Ice Age global culture challenges these assumptions not by denying evidence, but by questioning the frame through which evidence is interpreted. It asks us to consider that connectivity does not require uniformity. That shared knowledge does not require centralized control. That advancement can exist without leaving behind monumental scars. In a stable world, subtlety is sustainable. In an unstable world, subtlety is erased. The Ice Age created instability on a planetary scale. It favored survival strategies that were local, immediate, and adaptable. It discouraged long-range continuity. It broke chains of transmission that had taken millennia to form. And yet even broken chains leave links behind. Those links appear in the way humanity continues to search for lost origins, in the fascination with submerged ruins, in the sense that history is incomplete, in the feeling that something important lies just beyond reach. This fascination is not merely romantic. It reflects a deeper understanding that our relationship with the past is provisional, that what we know is contingent upon chance preservation, that entire ways of living can vanish without leaving a clear trace. As the modern world faces its own climatic uncertainties, this understanding takes on urgency. Rising seas once again threaten coastlines. Changing climates once again disrupt ecosystems. Human systems once again reveal their fragility. The Ice Age becomes more than a distant chapter, it becomes a mirror. It shows us what happens when the Earth changes faster than memory can adapt. It shows us how quickly knowledge tied to specific conditions can become obsolete. It shows us how easily continuity can fracture. And it invites a question that is both ancient and immediate. What kind of knowledge endures through change? Not the knowledge of specific places or tools, but the knowledge of how to adapt, how to observe, how to remain attentive to the rhythms of the world rather than imposing rigid expectations upon it. If a pre-Ice Age culture existed, its most enduring legacy may not be found in stone or soil, but in this adaptive mindset. A way of being that prioritized relationship over domination, awareness over accumulation. Such a legacy would not announce itself loudly. It would persist quietly, embedded in human intuition. It would appear in the instinct to watch the sky, in the respect for cycles, in the understanding that stability is precious and temporary. As night deepens and the mind grows heavier, these reflections soften into something closer to feeling than thought. The ancient past feels less like a mystery to be solved and more like a presence to be acknowledged. Not everything lost must be recovered. Not every question must be answered. Some truths endure precisely because they remain incomplete. The Ice Age reminds us that humanity's story is not just about progress, but about adaptation. Not just about building, but about remembering. Not just about what survives, but about what shapes us even when it does not. Beneath the modern world lies another, not hidden in secret, but submerged in time. Its outlines are faint, its details are blurred, but its influence is still felt in ways subtle and profound. And as long as humans continue to wonder about their origins, as long as they feel the pull of the deep past, as long as they listen for echoes beneath the noise of the present, that submerged world remains part of the story, not finished, not forgotten, simply waiting patiently within the long and breathing memory of the earth. As the imagined tide of memory recedes once more, what remains is not emptiness but depth. A sense that the past is layered beneath the present, not erased but folded into it. The Ice Age did not end the story of humanity's earlier world. It transformed the way that story could be remembered. Transformation is quieter than destruction. Destruction leaves rubble. Transformation leaves absence, and absence is difficult to interpret. When archaeologists and historians look back, they search for certainty. They look for edges they can define, moments they can label. But deep time resists this kind of clarity. It does not divide neatly. It blends, it overlaps, it fades. The Ice Age was not a wall between worlds. It was a long corridor stretching across thousands of years through which humanity slowly passed. Along the way, things were dropped, others were carried forward, some were reshaped so completely that their original forms can no longer be recognized. What was dropped most often was context. Context requires continuity. Continuity requires stability, and stability was rare. The people who lived before the cold intensified did not know they were living before anything. They did not mark their time as pre-ice age or pre-collapse. They lived in a present that felt complete. The knowledge they carried felt ordinary. It did not need preservation because it was embedded in daily life. This is often how the most important knowledge exists, not as something extraordinary, but as something assumed. When that assumption is broken, when the environment changes too quickly, when familiar cues disappear, knowledge suddenly becomes fragile. Practices once reinforced every day are no longer useful. Stories that once made sense lose their grounding. Skills refined over generations no longer apply. In that moment, humanity does what it has always done under pressure. It simplifies, it keeps what works, it releases what does not. This simplification is not a failure of intelligence. It is intelligence adapting to scarcity, but it has consequences. It narrows perception, it shortens memory, it makes the past feel distant and irrelevant. The Ice Age demanded this narrowing, and so humanity emerged from it changed, not diminished, but focused differently. Attention shifted from the long view to the immediate, from continuity to survival, from shared landscapes to defended territories. In this new orientation, the idea of a globally connected ancient culture became difficult to imagine, let alone remember. The world now appeared divided by nature itself. Oceans were barriers, mountains were walls, distances felt vast. The possibility that these divisions were recent, that they had not always existed, slipped quietly out of awareness. And yet, something within the human mind continued to resist that forgetting. It appears in the recurring sense that separation is temporary. That the world is meant to be traversed, that connection is natural. These ideas arise again and again across cultures and eras, even when circumstances discourage them. They surface in dreams of exploration, in myths of lost homelands, in the persistent belief that humanity shares a common origin deeper than history can explain. Perhaps this belief is not merely philosophical. Perhaps it is remembered. Not remembered consciously, but carried forward as an intuition shaped by long experience. An echo of a time when the world did not feel fragmented, when movement was gradual and continuous rather than abrupt and divided. If such a time existed, it would have shaped human psychology profoundly. It would have established expectations of openness, familiarity, and shared space. When those expectations were later broken by environmental change, the resulting tension would have left a lasting imprint. That imprint may be the source of humanity's enduring restlessness. The feeling that something has been lost, that the world is smaller than it should be, that there is more behind us than we can see. This restlessness is not nostalgia for a specific place or era. It is nostalgia for continuity. As the modern age accelerates change once again, compressing time and space through technology, the contrast becomes sharper. Humanity moves faster than ever, yet often feels more disconnected. Information multiplies, yet understanding feels fragmented. In this context, the deep past begins to feel relevant again, not as a blueprint for the future, but as a reminder of scale, of how long humanity has existed, of how many worlds it has already inhabited and lost. The Ice Age teaches that no single arrangement of land, climate, or culture is permanent, that what feels foundational may be temporary. That adaptation, not accumulation, is the true constant. If a pre-Ice Age global culture existed, its disappearance was not a punishment or a failure. It was a response to forces beyond human control, and its quiet dissolution may contain wisdom of its own. Rather than resisting change until it shattered, such a culture may have yielded gradually, allowing humanity to fragment and reform as conditions demanded. In doing so, it may have preserved something more durable than structures, a way of responding to uncertainty. This response lives on in humanity's ability to rebuild, to reimagine, to create meaning even when foundations shift. Civilizations rise and fall, but this capacity endures. As the night deepens further and the boundary between thought and sleep softens, the story of the ancient world becomes less about proving what existed and more about listening to what remains. The earth itself carries memory, in the shape of valleys carved by vanished rivers, in the contours of continental shelves drowned by rising seas, in the distribution of species shaped by ancient migrations, in the sediments that record cycles of ice and warmth. These memories are not narratives, they are patterns. Human memory, too, carries patterns, patterns of movement, patterns of attention, patterns of meaning. When these patterns align with the Earth's, a sense of resonance emerges, a feeling that the past is not gone but present in a different form. Perhaps this is why certain places feel timeless, why standing near ancient watercourses or beneath open skies evokes a sense of familiarity that defies explanation, why silence in nature often feels fuller than noise in cities. These experiences are not proofs, they are invitations, invitations to slow down, to widen perspective, to remember that humanity's story is not confined to recorded history. The Ice Age sits at the threshold of that reminder. It marks a point beyond which certainty dissolves, but meaning does not. It invites humility in the face of deep time and curiosity in the face of absence. It asks us to consider that what we cannot see may still matter, that what we cannot recover may still influence us, that what we cannot explain may still be true in some essential way. As the imagined ancient world recedes once more into silence, it leaves behind a final impression not of loss but of continuity beneath change. Of humanity as a thread woven through shifting landscapes, adapting without ever fully forgetting. And so the story does not conclude, it slows, it softens, it sinks gently beneath the surface of conscious thought where it continues to shape perception in ways subtle and profound, beneath the ice, beneath the sea, beneath the noise of the present. The memory of another world remains not as a place we can return to, but as a depth within us, reminding us that the past is larger than the present and that the story of humanity is still unfolding, carried forward by time itself. As the story drifts deeper into this quiet space, the boundary between what was and what is becomes less defined. The time no longer feels like a line stretching away from us, but like a vast landscape we are moving through slowly, step by step, often without realizing how far we have come or how much lies behind us. In this landscape of time, the Ice Age stands not as a distant monument, but as a wide plain we once crossed. Its influence did not end when the ice retreated. It continued to shape the terrain of human thought long afterward, guiding how people interpreted the world, how they understood risk, and how they related to uncertainty. Uncertainty became familiar. After living through generations of change that no one could control, humans learned to expect instability. Even in times of calm, there was an awareness, sometimes conscious, sometimes not, that the calm might not last. This awareness influenced behavior in subtle ways. It encouraged caution. It rewarded preparedness. It elevated those who could read signs and anticipate shifts. Perhaps this is why early societies placed such importance on watchers and observers. Those who studied the sky, the land, the animals, the seasons. Those who could sense change before it arrived. These individuals were not merely specialists, they were guardians of continuity in a world that had proven itself capable of erasing familiarity. Their role may have descended from something much older. In a pre-Ice Age world, observation may have been a shared responsibility rather than a specialized one. When environments were stable and movement was gradual, everyone had time to learn the rhythms of the land. Knowledge flowed easily, reinforced daily by experience. There was less need for designated keepers of wisdom because wisdom was woven into life itself. When that stability ended, knowledge condensed. It gathered in fewer hands. It became ritualized. It took on symbolic form. This condensation was necessary for survival, but it also changed the relationship between people and knowledge. What had once been lived became taught. What had once been obvious became sacred, and what had once been shared freely became protected, even guarded. In this way, the Ice Age may have marked the beginning of hierarchy, not as a social invention, but as an adaptive response. When knowledge becomes scarce, those who hold it gain influence. When interpretation becomes difficult, authority replaces familiarity. This shift reshaped societies long after the ice was gone. The memory of environmental collapse lingered beneath the surface, reinforcing the idea that stability must be maintained, that order must be enforced, that deviation could invite disaster. Over time, this anxiety hardened into structure. Laws, customs, and institutions formed to keep chaos at bay, and yet chaos had never truly been conquered. The earth continued to change, the climate continued to fluctuate, floods, droughts, and earthquakes persisted. Each disruption echoed the ancient pattern, reminding humanity that control was always provisional. That certainty was temporary. That adaptation remained essential. This persistent tension between the desire for permanence and the reality of change became one of the defining features of human civilization. It drove innovation and fear in equal measure. It inspired creation and destruction alike, and beneath it all lay the deep, unspoken memory of a world that had once changed everything. As centuries passed, humanity learned to tell stories not just to remember, but to soothe. Stories explained why the world behaved as it did. They offered reasons for suffering and hope for renewal. They framed catastrophe as part of a larger cycle rather than an incomprehensible threat. In many of these stories, the world is destroyed and reborn. Flood washes away corruption. A fire cleanses the land. A great darkness gives way to light. These narratives are comforting because they impose meaning on loss. They suggest that endings are not final but transitional, that something better may follow. This belief may have been shaped by lived experience. The Ice Age was not a single ending but a prolonged transformation. It destroyed certain ways of living, but it also opened the way for others. It narrowed the world, but it did not extinguish humanity. Life continued, adapted, and eventually flourished again in new forms. From this perspective, the Ice Age becomes less a tragedy and more a teacher. It demonstrated that survival does not depend on preserving everything. It showed that letting go can be as important as holding on. It revealed that memory, when too rigid, can become a burden rather than a guide. Perhaps the ancient world understood this intuitively. Perhaps its greatest lesson was not how to build something that would last forever, but how to exist in a way that allowed humanity to move through change without losing itself entirely. This lesson is subtle. It does not announce itself in ruins or records. It appears in attitudes, in instincts, in the quiet acceptance of impermanence that surfaces in moments of reflection. It appears in the way humans still gather to watch sunsets and eclipses, in the way silence is often treated with reverence, in the way people sense that there is more to the world than what can be measured or controlled. These responses are not taught explicitly. They are inherited. They suggest a lineage of experience stretching back beyond written memory, shaped by forces that demanded humility and awareness rather than dominance. As the modern mind drifts toward sleep, freed from the urgency of problem solving, it becomes easier to sense this lineage. Constant noise of the present recedes, and something older rises to the surface, not as a clear image, but as a feeling of depth. The Ice Age belongs to this depth. It is not merely an event in the distant past. It is a layer of experience embedded in the human story. It reminds us that the world has ended before in ways that felt total to those who lived through it, and yet life continued. This reminder carries both comfort and warning. Comfort because it shows that humanity is resilient. Warning because it shows that resilience does not guarantee continuity of culture, memory, or understanding. What survives is not always what is most valued. What endures is often what is most adaptable. As the imagined ancient world fades once more into the background, it leaves behind a question that lingers without demanding an answer. What parts of our own world are we assuming will last? What knowledge are we tying too tightly to current conditions? What memories are we failing to carry forward in ways that can survive change? The Ice Age does not answer these questions for us. It simply invites us to ask them. And perhaps that invitation is the most important legacy of all. Not a lost civilization to be rediscovered, not a forgotten technology to be reclaimed, but a reminder that humanity's story is shaped as much by forgetting as by remembering, and that wisdom lies in recognizing the difference. As sleep approaches and the mind relaxes into stillness, the ancient world does not vanish. It settles quietly beneath awareness like a deep ocean beneath a calm surface. As the current of thought slows even further, the ancient world feels less distant and more like a quiet companion. It does not demand attention. It does not interrupt. It simply remains present in the background like a low, steady breath beneath the surface of waking awareness. This is how the deep past survives. Not through force, not through certainty, but through persistence. Long after the Ice Age reshaped the land, humanity continued to move forward, carrying this persistence within itself. People learned to live in smaller worlds more clearly defined by geography and climate. They learned to make meaning within boundaries. They learned to accept limitation as normal, yet the human imagination never fully accepted enclosure. Even as villages became towns and towns became cities, stories reached beyond the horizon. Tales of distant lands, lost realms, and ancient ages circulated among people who had never seen such places. These stories did not arise because people were dissatisfied with their present. They arose because something in the human mind remembered openness, a memory not of a specific place but of possibility. The Ice Age had constrained movement, but it had not extinguished the impulse to wander. It had broken continuity, but it had not erased curiosity. It had narrowed the physical world, but the inner world remained expansive. This tension between inner vastness and outer limitation became a defining feature of humanity. It drove exploration when conditions allowed. It fueled creativity when movement was restricted. It inspired both innovation and longing. In many ways, this longing shaped civilization as much as necessity did. People built not only to survive, but to anchor themselves. To create fixed points in a world that had proven itself capable of dramatic change. Stone replaced wood, permanence replaced mobility. Memory was externalized into structures, symbols, and eventually texts. But no matter how much was externalized, something essential remained internal. An intuition that the world is dynamic, an understanding that what exists now may not exist forever, a quiet readiness for change. These qualities are difficult to measure, but they are deeply human. They suggest a lineage shaped by repeated encounters with uncertainty, adaptation, and loss, encounters that began long before recorded history. The Ice Age stands as one of the most profound of these encounters, not because of its cold alone, but because of its duration. It unfolded slowly enough that no single generation could fully grasp it, yet persistently enough that no generation could escape its influence. This slow pressure reshaped humanity from the inside. It encouraged patience. It rewarded observation. It fostered resilience over rigidity. These traits may be among the most enduring legacies of that time. When the world finally warmed and stabilized, humanity did not simply return to what it had been before. Too much had changed. Landscapes were altered. Species distributions shifted. Knowledge systems had adapted to scarcity and fragmentation. The past could not be restored, it could only be transformed. And so new cultures emerged, shaped by both what had survived and what had been lost. They inherited instincts without understanding their origin. They practiced rituals without remembering their first purpose. They built monuments without knowing the earliest forms that had inspired them. This inheritance was incomplete, but it was not empty. It carried forward a sense of relationship with the earth that was older than agriculture, older than cities, older than writing. A sense that humans are participants in a living system rather than masters of it. Over time, this sense was often overshadowed by ambition and control. As technologies advanced and populations grew, humanity tested the limits of its environment. Forests were cleared, rivers were redirected, landscapes were reshaped to suit immediate needs. For a while it seemed as though the earth could be bent indefinitely, but the deeper memory never vanished entirely. It surfaced in moments of disaster. In times of famine or flood, in the quiet acknowledgement that some forces remain beyond control, these moments reawakened ancient awareness, the same awareness shaped by the Ice Age, the understanding that stability is negotiated, not guaranteed, that adaptation is continuous, that survival depends on listening as much as acting. Perhaps this is why humanity has always been drawn to cycles. To the idea that time repeats, that endings give way to beginnings, that destruction and creation are intertwined. This worldview is not naive optimism. It is a reflection of lived experience across deep time. The Ice Age was not the first transformation humanity endured, nor was it the last. But it was one of the most formative because it unfolded at a scale that touched every part of the planet and every lineage of people. In its aftermath, humanity learned to live with uncertainty as a constant companion. As the modern world accelerates, compressing change into shorter and shorter spans, this ancient lesson feels newly relevant. The pace may be faster now, the tools more complex, but the underlying dynamic is familiar. Environments change, systems strain, continuity is tested. Once again, humanity faces questions that echo those of the distant past. How do we preserve what matters? What knowledge will endure? What will future generations inherit? The Ice Age does not provide simple answers, but it offers perspective. It shows that survival alone is not enough to preserve culture. That memory must be adaptable. That wisdom must be carried in forms resilient enough to survive upheaval. It suggests that the most enduring aspects of humanity are not its structures, but its capacities for awareness, for learning, for meaning-making. These capacities were shaped long before history began recording itself. They were shaped under skies unfamiliar to us, on lands now submerged, among people whose names are lost but whose influence remains. As sleep draws closer, the details of this imagined ancient world soften, sharp distinctions blur. The focus shifts from what can be known to what can be felt, a sense of continuity, a sense of humility, a sense of belonging to something larger than any single era. The Ice Age becomes less an event and more a reminder that humanity is part of a story far older than its records and far broader than its current understanding. This story does not move toward a final conclusion. It unfolds in layers, each era adding depth rather than closure. The present is simply the latest surface, resting atop countless others. Beneath it lie worlds shaped by ice and flood, by movement and memory, by adaptation and loss. Worlds that no longer exist as places but persist as influences. They shape how humans think, how they fear, how they hope, and perhaps most importantly, how they remember. Not in precise detail, not with certainty, but with a quiet sense that the past is not finished with us. As the mind settles into rest, the ancient world recedes once more, not into darkness, but into depth. It remains accessible, not through effort, but through openness. Through the willingness to acknowledge that humanity's story is vast, complex, and only partially visible. And in that acknowledgement there is peace, because to recognize the depth of time is to release the need for absolute answers, to accept that some truths are carried forward not as facts but as feelings, not as records but as instincts. The Ice Age shaped those instincts. The forgotten world shaped them too. And as long as humans continue to wonder, to reflect, and to listen in the quiet moments between waking and sleep, that shaping continues. The story does not end here. It rests, it waits, and it continues slowly and patiently within the long and living memory of humanity and the earth alike. As the story reaches its final quiet horizon, it does not arrive at an ending so much as a resting place. A wide, open space where thought slows, where questions no longer press for answers, and where the past and present gently overlap. The ancient world we have been imagining does not ask to be proven. It does not require certainty to exist. It lives instead in possibility, in the understanding that humanity's journey is far longer and more complex than any single narrative can contain. If the Ice Age destroyed an advanced global culture, it did so without malice. Ice has no intention. Water holds no memory of what it covers. The earth moves according to forces that do not recognize human achievement or loss. Change unfolds whether we are ready for it or not, and yet humanity endured, not unchanged, not untouched, but alive. That endurance may be the most important inheritance of all. Whatever existed before the ice, whether it was a deeply connected world, a shared understanding of land and sky, or simply a longer continuity than we now recognize, it shaped humanity in ways that did not vanish when coastlines drowned and climates shifted. It shaped how we adapt, how we imagine, how we remember. Even now, when the modern world feels overwhelming in its speed and scale, people instinctively return to ancient rhythms for comfort. They watch sunsets, they follow the stars. They seek quiet places where the land feels older than the present moment. These impulses are not trends, they are echoes. They suggest that beneath technology and culture, something older remains awake. A part of the human mind that remembers living closer to the Earth's cycles, a part that understands without words that stability is never guaranteed, and that awareness is a form of resilience. The Ice Age taught humanity that the world can change completely and still continue. That loss does not erase meaning. That memory does not need to be perfect to be powerful. If a global culture once existed and was erased by ice and flood, its greatest legacy may not be what it built, but what it instilled, an ability to live within uncertainty without losing the capacity for wonder. This is not a story of vanished greatness. It is a story of continuity through change. Civilizations rise and fall, landscapes emerge and disappear, oceans advance and retreat. But humanity persists, shaped by every world it has ever inhabited. Perhaps the most humbling realization is this: even now we are living in a world that will one day be forgotten. Our coastlines may change, our cities may vanish, our records may fragment. Future generations may look back at us through incomplete evidence, wondering who we were and how we lived. They may speculate, they may doubt, they may imagine, just as we do now. And that symmetry is not tragic, it is natural. It places us within the same cycle as those who lived before the ice, people who did not know they were standing at the edge of forgetting, yet lived fully within their present moment. The Ice Age reminds us that history is not only what survives, but what shapes us quietly and invisibly, that the deepest influences are often the hardest to trace, that some truths endure not because they are recorded, but because they are felt. So as this long journey through time comes to rest, there is no final conclusion to draw, only a gentle awareness to carry forward. An awareness that the past is deeper than it appears, that humanity's story is broader than its records, and that beneath the surface of the modern world lies a vast, quiet inheritance shaped by ice, water, movement, and memory. If you have listened this far, you are now part of that ongoing story, someone willing to pause, to imagine, and to consider the depth of where we come from. If you enjoyed this journey and would like to continue exploring the quiet mysteries of history together, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories. And if this narration reached you tonight, I'd love to know. Leave a comment and tell us where you're listening from in the world. Until next time, rest well. And let the ancient past drift gently with you into sleep.